Good morning. Um, Jupiter and I. Hello again. I did want to show you guys something very exciting. I started to get some sprouts in my starter plants. So, just thought I would share that with you. We also have our one of our class plants right there enjoying the window. Um, we are on chapter 15 of the People of Sparks. We're officially into the second part of the book. We left off yesterday with Lena snuck onto Casper's truck to go roaming. She thought they were only going to be gone for a few days, but now it might be a few months. And Torin is trying to set Dune up that he is the one who is wasting all the tomatoes, and just there's really the tensions are really coming to a head. So, excuse me. Chapter 15, A Long Hot Ride. Lena lay very still, or as still as she could with the jolting of the truck over the rutted road. Her eyes were at the level of the space between the two lowest slats of the crate so that she could see just enough to guess where they were. Along the road by the river first, and then turning to go around the outskirts of the village. Occasionally she heard someone call a greeting to Casper, and she heard Casper's voice returning it. Maddie never said anything that Lena could hear. After a while, there were no more voices. The sun beat down on Lena's back, and she began to get terribly hot and uncomfortable. She thought it might be safe to sit up now. The sound of the wheels would muffle any sound she made, and she was far enough toward the back of the truck that Casper and Maddie wouldn't see her moving. So she unfolded herself. She peered out and saw emptiness, vast stretches of dry, brown, gold grass, no people, no houses. It was an enormous space. She had not realized any place could be so big. Sometime in the afternoon, because of the heat and the rocking motion of the truck, and because there was nothing else to do, Lena went to sleep. When she awoke, she could tell right away that it was nearly evening. The air was cooler. The sun was so low in the sky that she could no longer see it overhead. Its slanting rays came between the slates of her crate. A cramp gripped her stomach. It was partly hunger. She hadn't thought to bring any food with her, but it was mostly fear. They must be close to the city, and when they arrived, what would she do? And what would Casper do when he found her? The truck slowed and came to a stop. Lena felt Casper and Maddie jump down. "This looks like a good enough place. Near the water, anyhow," said Casper's voice. "Looks all right to me," said Maddie. "I'll take the animals down to the stream," said Casper. Lena heard clanking and slapping sounds as he unbuckled the harness, and then the slow thud of the hooves as the oxen were led away. What was Maddie doing? Lena heard a few footsteps, some rustling among the grasses. Then there was silence. She had to move. Her legs were cramped and she had a pain in her back. Cautiously, she stood up. She stepped out onto the first slate of the crate and then the second, and when she got high enough to look over the top edge, the first thing she saw was Maddie, sitting on the ground a few feet from the end of the truck, leaning against a tree, staring right at her. "Well, well, look who's here," said Maddie. Lena just stared. She couldn't move. Maddie heaved herself up from the ground and came over to the truck. She regarded Lena with a look that was half puzzled and half amused. "What in the world are you doing here?" "I want to see the city," said Lena. "Don't you know it's a 5-day journey? How did you expect to ride in a crate all that time and not be discovered?" "5 days? I thought it was only one day." Maddie just shook her head. "What are we supposed to do with you?" "I don't know," said Lena. She felt a trembling start up in her stomach. She should never have come. There was a long pause before Maddie spoke again. Then she said, "Listen, it would suit me fine if you came to the city, if you're sure you want to." "I do want to," Lena said, though she wasn't really sure. "Good, 'cause you kind of don't have a choice," said Maddie. She smiled. It wasn't an unfriendly smile, but there was a quirk in it that seemed to say, "What a situation." "Stay there, then. I'll be back." She stamped away. Lena watched Maddie heading toward a strip of green grass and low trees that must border the stream. At the edge of the strip, she could see Casper and the oxen. In all directions, the landscape was the same she had seen that morning, gently rolling, empty of buildings covered with brown old grass. Here and there stood low, dark green mushroom shaped trees. Three of them stood near the truck, their leaves dusty, their trunks thick and gnarled. The sun had gone down behind the hills in the west, and the sky there was scarlet. Though the air was still warm, Lena shivered. She sat back down in the crate, pulled her knees up to her chest, and wrapped her arms around them. Somewhere a bird sang its going to bed song. Then suddenly there was a loud footsteps and Casper's voice coming toward her, and in a moment Casper's fist started to thud against the crate. "Come out," he said. Lena climbed out and stood on the truck looking down at him. "Jump down," he said. She jumped down. Casper glared at her. "So, a stowaway. What were you trying to do? Cause trouble? That's your idea of fun?" "No," said Lena. "I want to see the city." "What for?" A look of suspicion passed over Casper's face. "What do you know about the city?" "Nothing," said Lena. She wasn't going to tell Casper about her vision of the city or what the city might be for the people of Ember. "I just want to see it." "Well, too bad," said Casper. "Why should I take you here? Why would I want an extra person to feed, a kid to look after? Your ride stops here. You can go back where you came." "1 second," said Maddie. "Listen to me before you decide. She could be useful to us." "Don't be ridiculous." Casper whacked his two big hands together as if to dismiss the subject. "Yes, she could," said Maddie. "When you're looking for something in a ruined place, you know how it is. Small spaces sometimes. Tippy rubble where you need to step carefully. A small light person could go where we can't." Casper took a step back and studied Lena, still glowering. Lena tried to look as small and light as she could. "As for food," said Maddie, "she can share mine." "Ridiculous," said Casper again, but he kept his eyes on Lena. She could see that he was thinking about it. "Come on, Casper," Maddie said. "Let's take her. We don't have much choice after all. The only other thing we have is to leave her here by herself." She turned to Lena. "If we let you come, you'll have to work. You'll have to do what we say." "All right," Lena said, though she wasn't sure it was all right at all. Maybe it would be better to give up seeing the city and try to get back to Sparks from here. But how would she do that? She'd never be able to find her way. And the empty lands frightened her. She didn't want to be alone in such a vast, wild place. "But how will I get back? Will you take me?" "You should have thought of that when you climbed onto the truck," said Casper. "That's your problem, not ours." He turned to Maddie. "Right, partner?" "Certainly," Maddie said. "Now let's get settled for the night. The first thing we need is some kindling. Lena and I will go and get some." Lena followed her out toward the trees. Once they were in among them, Maddie bent down and spoke to her in a low voice. "Don't worry. You were foolish to do this, but I won't let any harm come to you. And I'll see that you get home again, somehow." She straightened up again. "Now, gather some dry twigs and sticks and a few tufts of dry grass." They carried the sticks and grass back to where the truck was parked. There Maddie scraped out a hollow hole in the ground with the heel of her shoe. In the hole she set the smallest splinters of wood, arranging them in a sort of square. Over those she placed some sticks, and on top of that she added larger branches. She tucked in some handfuls of dry grass at the bottom of the stick building. Until this point, Lena did not understand what she was doing, but when she pulled from her pocket a little cloth-wrapped package, unwrapped it, and took out a short, blue-tipped stick, she knew. She took in a quick breath and stepped backwards. Maddie held up one of the matches. "Have you ever seen one of these?" "Yes," said Lena. "You're lucky then," said Maddie. "They're rare." She struck the match across the rock and the blue tip burst into flame. She held it to the grass and the grass sizzled and flared up. "Come and stand close," she said to Lena. "We need to shield this from the breeze until it really gets going." But Lena stayed where she was, just staring. The little flame at the heart of the stick flickered. It reached for and splintered end of a stick, caught it, set it aflame. The sizzling grew to a hissing and then to a crackling. Flames jumped and jumped higher, and there again was that orange hand stretching upward with its pointed fingers, waving, leaning toward her. Lena stumbled backward. She didn't want to be afraid. Casper and Maddie weren't. Casper had come back now and was crouching right beside the fire, feeding it with sticks and grass. But for Lena, it was as if the flames were shrieking a message at her. "Run! Run! Run!" She stood 20 feet away, staring at the fire with a pounding heart. The wind blew a ribbon of smoke at her, and when she breathed, it stung the back of her throat. Maddie noticed after a while that she was out there. "Come closer, Lena. It won't hurt you," she called. But Lena could not get her feet to walk toward that hissing, snapping blaze. It might not hurt Maddie and Casper, but if she were to stand near, she was sure it would reach for her with that orange hand, flick its fingers against the end of her hair or the hem of her skirt, and she would flare up. "I'm all right here," she said. "I don't want to be near it." Casper laughed. Maddie lumbered to her feet and came beside Lena. She put an arm around her. "You're shaking," she said. "Well, never mind. You don't have to stand by the fire if you don't want to." From a box on the truck, she took what they called traveler cakes, lumps a little smaller than a fist, made of Lena knew not what, and she and Casper stuck them on the end of lawn sticks and roasted them over the flames. "You have to get fond of these if you're a roamer. They keep well, that's their best quality. You need them for those long stretches where there's no other food to be found." They were dry and tasteless, but Lena was hungry, so she didn't mind much. She ate hers standing up, and she licked her fingers when she was done. She wondered where they were going to sleep. There was no room on the truck, so she supposed they'd have to lie on the ground. It was quite dark now. A breeze had come up. From somewhere far away, she heard an animal noise. "Yip, yip, yip!" Then a long wail, then an eerie chorus of wails. "What was that?" she asked Maddie. "Wolves," Maddie said. "Out hunting. They're not very close. Don't worry." Lena shivered. The darkness here was so enormous and so full of terrible things. In Ember, except when there was a blackout, people were almost always safe in their beds when darkness came. Lena wasn't used to being outside at night. She thought about Mrs. Murdo, who would be now getting into bed in the doctor's attic right now. Mrs. Murdo would be worried about her. Poppy would be saying, "Where's Wina?" No one would imagine that she was out in this great emptiness with nothing between her and the sky. Maddie took some rolled up blankets from the truck and spread them on the ground. She put two of them close to the fire. The third she offered to Lena. "Put this wherever you want to sleep," she said. Lena walked over to take the blanket, and as she did, Casper tossed a big branch onto the fire. Sparks sprayed up. Some flew sideways, caught by the wind. Lena jumped back, but a few sparks landed on her sock. She stamped her foot frantically, but this only made the sparks burn brighter. The threads of her sock glowed. On her ankle she felt a pain, like a fierce bite. "No! Get off me!" she cried. She shook her leg and clawed at her sock with her hand. Panic rose up in her, and she would have taken off running if Maddie had not blocked her path and grabbed her with her strong arms. When she stopped her, she bent down and put a hand over the burning place in Lena's sock, and when she took her hand away, the glow was gone. But the pain was still there. Maddie took off Lena's shoe and sock and poured cold water on the burn, but it didn't help much. All night, Lena huddled on the ground under the thin blanket, gritting her teeth against the pain on her leg and wishing she had never come on this awful journey. Chapter 16 is called The Starving Roamer. Starving Roamer. Okay. The next morning, after a breakfast of plums and coarse bread, they set out again. Maddie made Lena a place to sit at the back of the truck between two of the crates. She took the blankets they slept on and spread them on the rough floor of the truck. Lena could sit on the blankets, lean against the nearest crate, and dangle her legs over the truck's back edge. The burn still hurt this evening. It was a reddish, angry-looking blister. After a while, as the sun came up and sweet, grassy smells arose from the earth, Lena began to enjoy herself again. She watched the countryside fall away behind the truck, stretches of brown gold grass as big as the sky, trees like hairy spikes, rocky slopes. Excuse me. And this is how it was for 4 more days. At night, they would find a place by a stream to sleep, if they could find a stream. They passed other ox-pulled cars and trucks on their way, both going their direction and coming back. They would stop and talk with these roamers and sometimes trade with them for food. Casper always asked if they had been to the city. Very few of them had. The ones that had been there just shook their heads when Casper asked if they had found anything. "It's a waste of time to go there. Don't bother." Most of the roamers they met had been scavenging in what they called the suburbs, which Lena understood to mean towns that laid around the city. Casper and Maddie hardly spoke to her at all during the day. Around noon, they would stop the truck and get something to eat from the chest of provisions they had brought. At first, there was dried fruit, but soon that was all used up. After that, it was traveler's cakes, morning, noon, and night. Caspar always went to sleep right after he'd filled his belly. He would lay back on the ground and snore. Then Maddie would beckon to Lena with a tilt of her head, and then they would walk away from Caspar and find a place to sit, often beneath a tree, one of those big trees that spread their branches out like the top of a big mushroom. They would sit in the soft grass and look up at the sky through the branches. Sometimes a breeze swept across the land and brought them the scent of dusty earth and dry weeds. After lunch on their second day of traveling, Lena asked Maddie where she came from. A horrible place, was all she would say. Horrible in what way? Small, cold, and poor. Houses made out of old boards, bad soil for growing things, never enough food, a place that was withering. What does that mean, withering? Lena asked. It means shrinking and dying. Things were getting worse there. There was too much sickness, too much hunger, too much unhappiness. People were always quarreling, and a lot of them were leaving. It was ending, the place where I came from. I wanted to be somewhere that was beginning. Our city was ending too, said Lena. She looked up at the blue sky and thought about the sky in Ember. Utter blackness, not a speck of light. No light shone anywhere in Ember now. There's no one left in our city, she said. Sparks is a place that is beginning, said Maddie, if it can get past the hard spots. Hard spots? Yes, like suddenly having to take in 400 people. Oh, said Lena, remembering the conflicts in the village and all the reasons she wanted to get away from there. Her heart sank. Maybe by the time we get back, that'll all be over. All the trouble, she said. Maybe, said Maddie. I hope so. Sparks is a whole lot better than where I came from. I can understand why you wanted to leave that place, said Lena. Pretty badly, said Maddie. Bad enough to take up with a fool. Fool? Maddie just tipped her head toward the sleeping Caspar. You came with him just to get away? Lena whispered. Maddie nodded. Roamers hardly ever come to our little settlement, she said, mainly because we had nothing to trade. Caspar was only the second one I'd ever seen. I thought I might never see another, so I grabbed the chance. Why couldn't you just leave by yourself? I thought of it, Maddie said, but I didn't know where to go. I didn't know the roads or where the settlements were. I didn't know how I would get food. I guess I just wasn't bold enough to go by myself. When you got to Sparks, you could have stayed there, Lena said. You didn't have to keep traveling with him. I would have stayed, said Maddie, if I hadn't promised to help him on this quest of his. I try to honor my promises, if I possibly can. That afternoon, as they traveled on across the rolling hills, Lena thought about places that were ending and places that were beginning. She knew about endings. Now she wanted to be part of a beginning. Maybe the people of Ember could begin again in the city. If not, well, she wouldn't think about that until she had to. On the second night, they pulled up beside the ruins of a town. Not much was left of it, but you could see that once there had been hundreds of houses. The concrete foundations, overgrown with weeds, lined up along curved streets. Here and there a wall or a chimney was still standing. Caspar stopped the truck just beyond the outer row of ruins, and Maddie went around to the back and opened the trunk that held their dwindling supply of food. They had stopped beside a ditch where a trickle of water ran. It was green, scummy water, but Lena drank it anyways. It was all there was. Caspar seemed especially grouchy. His pink face was splotched and damp, and his eyes looked inflamed. He had forgotten to twist his mustache into points, and it hung down at the corner of his mouth. He dug a crumbling traveler's cake from the trunk and glowered at Maddie. What's the matter with you, anyway? He said. You haven't been very chatty lately. I'm never chatty, said Maddie calmly. Caspar took a savage bite of his cake. It's like traveling with a tree stump. I thought you were going to be a pleasant and helpful companion. Maddie did not reply to this. She chewed serenely, gazing out over the acres of fallen houses. Lena realized there was a certain beauty in Maddie that she hadn't seen before. Her back was straight. She held her head high, and there was something unswayable in her. The bones of her face were strong, and her gaze was firm. There was nothing fluttery about her. You could see that Caspar was finding out that she was not what he had taken for at first. She was more than he had bargained for. On the third day, near evening, they saw a truck coming toward them from a great distance away. They were on a long straight road with a few trees or buildings to block their view, just the dry brown grass and a few ancient fences leaning over, flocks of birds rising, swooping through the air and fluttering down again. Up ahead came this dark dot toiling forward. In 20 minutes or so, the two trucks drew near. Lena stood behind Caspar and Maddie, looking forward. This roamer looked poor. He had only one ox, a shaggy, sway-backed animal, and on his truck there were only two crates, not four like on Caspar's. The man himself was almost as shaggy as the ox. His hair was long and his beard lay like a hairy brown bib against his chest. As he came closer, he stood up on his truck and shaded his eyes with his hands. "Watch out for this one," Caspar said. "Could be a bandit. Looks bad and mean and dangerous." When the other truck was 20 or 30 feet away, its driver suddenly hauled on the traces. His ox veered and the truck turned sideways so that it blocked the road. Lena couldn't tell if he had done this on purpose. His movements were jerky, as if something was wrong with him. He climbed down from his truck and stood in front of it, his neck tucked down and his shoulders hunched as high as his ears. His eyes glittered in his hairy face. He stood there like that, saying nothing, waiting for them. Caspar stopped the truck. He stood up and leaned forward. "Get out of my way, you ragged wretch! Move that flea-bitten rig!" The roamer came a few paces closer. His mouth opened, a hole in the tangle of beard, but no words came out. Lena could see the back of Caspar's neck flush deep red. "I said, get out of my way!" He snatched up his whip and sent the long lash curling out toward the man and slapped it a few feet away from his face. The roamer let out a howl. He lurched toward him. All this happened in only a minute or so. Lena's heart was beating wildly. Was this a bandit? Was he going to attack him? She ducked down behind a crate and peered between the slats. Caspar raised the whip again. "Come any closer and I'll cut you to shreds," he shouted. But before he could lash out, Maddie grabbed his arm. "Wait," she said. Caspar tried to shake her off, but she yanked at him so hard he lost his balance and sat down again. "Why not find out what this man wants before you attack him?" she said. Caspar struggled against her, but she was strong. She managed to wrench the whip out of his hand. Then she jumped down and confronted the other roamer, who had halted just in front of the truck. "What do you want from us?" she said to him, standing squarely in his path, her hands on her wide hips. "Why have you stopped us like this?" The roamer backed up a step. He looked at her with his mouth hanging open. He was grubby, Lena saw. His hands and his feet were bare and nearly black with dirt. He mumbled something. Maddie bent closer to him. "What?" he mumbled again. She turned to Caspar, who had climbed down from the truck and was approaching with his fist clenched. "He says he's out of cakes." She turned back to the man. "How long has it been since you've eaten?" The man stared at his hands. He had long, filthy fingernails. His fingers twitched. 3 days, he croaked. Just crumbs. 3 days. "Well," said Caspar, "if you think we're giving you any of our food, you're very mistaken." "Oh, surely we can spare a couple of cakes," Maddie said. Caspar's face was dark red. "We cannot," he said. "We're on a special mission, extremely important. We need that food for ourselves, all of it." Lena thought that was unreasonable. "You can have one of mine," she said. Caspar rolled around. "No, you're going to need your strength," he said. "You're being ridiculous," said Maddie. But Caspar reached out and pushed her. "Back in the truck," he said. "And you," turning back to the roamer, "get your rattle trap out of my way if you want to stay alive." From the roamer came a sound Lena had never heard before from a human being, a hoarse hissing sound, as if he were spitting a stream of fire straight into Caspar's face. He did this twice, and then he turned away and scuttled back to his truck. He pulled on the ox's traces, and it moved a few feet along, just far enough for Caspar to drive his truck past it. Caspar yelled at him one more time when he passed. "You shouldn't be a roamer if you can't feed yourself." He cracked his whip at the man and drove on. Lena climbed into a crate and sat with her head on her knees for a while after this. She was horrified by the starving, filthy roamer. How did he come to be in such a state? Was it his own fault? Was he a madman? But Casper could have given him something, couldn't he? Or were they so low on food that losing any of it really would harm them? Her stomach lurched. She felt queasy. She didn't know if it was hunger or horror at what she had just seen. That night, Lena woke up for a moment and heard the oxen making unsettled noises. She heard a creaking sound too, but the sound stopped and she went back to sleep. In the morning, Maddie discovered that they had been robbed. Well, well, she said, opening the food chest. Look here. What? Said Casper, who was wetting his mustache with spit and twisting it into points. Someone's bit into our food, said Maddie. I wonder who. Casper jumped to his feet. Into our food? He didn't get much, Maddie said. Just 3 or 4, I guess. She put her hand on in the chest and felt around. But he left us something. Sputtering with rage, Casper hauled himself up onto the truck. When he looked into the food chest, he let out a string of furious swear words. Lena crept out from under her blanket and stood up. What is it? What happened? Our friend from yesterday has been for a visit, said Maddie. We wouldn't give him what he wanted, so he took it and left us something too. Left what? Asked Lena. Casper was shaking with fury. His face was dark red. Looks like dirt, said Maddie. I think he took what he wanted and dumped a bag of dirt on the rest. She wrinkled her nose. Or maybe there's some ox droppings in here too. That skunk, Casper cried. That miserable rat. In my opinion, said Maddie, you should have given him a couple of cakes in the first place. I didn't ask for your opinion, said Casper. You're going to get it anyway, said Maddie, suddenly angry. You turned a crazy old guy into an enemy in less than 2 minutes. You did that. You've done it over and over. I've seen you. You approach people like an enemy and bam, they turn into one, whether they were to begin with or not. Well, it's my policy to be ready to defend myself, said Casper, at any moment. Fine, said Maddie. So now, because of your policy, we're out 4 cakes instead of 2, and we have a lot of dirt on the rest. She closed the chest, stood up, and glared at Casper with a mixture of anger and scorn. If you ask me, making friends is a better defense than making enemies. I didn't ask you, said Casper. On the 4th day, they went uphill hour after hour. The heat was terrible. The only water they found was at the bottom of a deep ravine. All 3 of them scrambled down, half stepping and half sliding. Carrying Casper's biggest pots and sweating and gasping, they lugged the filled pots back up so that the oxen could drink. Then they went uphill some more. It was late afternoon by the time they came to the top of the ridge. Lena was so tired by that time and so hot that she felt like a boiled vegetable, limp and runny. She was a bit dazed too, only half awake, and so she was startled when the truck jolted to a stop and she heard sharp exclamations from Casper and Maddie. She jumped down and went around to the front. A tremendous view of land and water laid before her, such immense water she had never seen. Green-blue, glinting in the rays of the late sun, white ripples racing across its surface. To her right, it stretched as far as she could see, but straight ahead, she could see the shore on the other side, green trees covering the ground and hills rising above. The bay, said Casper. This means we're almost there. We go around the end of it and then north. When do we get to the city? Lena said. Tomorrow, said Casper. His white face broke into a grin and he laughed his high, weird laugh. He opened and closed his fingers, stretching and gripping as if they were imagining taking hold of something. We'll be there tomorrow and then our work begins. Wow. A lot of fighting words between Casper and Maddie. Let me know what you guys are thinking about those 2 chapters of them traveling the 5-day journey to the city. Chapter 17 is called Dune Accused, and we will be reading that tomorrow. So, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and let me know what you guys are up to, or if you want to see Jupiter doing anything, or taking a funny picture or something. So, alright. Bye, guys.